Braincast, der Schulfunk zum Gehirn.
Wir sind hier an der Freien Universität in Berlin am Cluster Languages of Emotion und ich habe die große Ehre, heute mit Professor Jaak Panksepp zu sprechen. Herzlich willkommen, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
When it comes to research, you're probably the most famous tickler of rats in the world. And last not least, you coined the term affective neuroscience. So to start with an easy question, what are emotions?
Well, emotions are the way we feel in a certain way. It is not a sensory feeling like the pleasure of a wonderful cake or the pain when you step on a stone. Those are sensory feelings. They're very important feelings. We also have very large bodily feelings. We get hungry. We get thirsty. If we run and exercise, we run out of air. And these are also very important feelings. But on top of that, we have these emotional feelings. And the emotional feelings are very large bodily and brain responses to the world. And they tell animals what is important for survival inside the brain. So it's not just outside sensory, it's not your internal receptors of your body, they are the needs of the brain, such as someone taking valuable resources from you and you get angry. That anger is a very basic response. It's the same as if an animal wants you for a meal and you have to run away and you're scared. That is built into the brain. So affective neuroscience is the scientific discipline that tries to understand the emotional feelings of the brain. And how many are there? How are they organized anatomically inside the brain? What are the neurochemistries? And why is this important? It's because these are the types of things that we are actually built around. The emotions are very deep value systems in the brain. And when they become imbalanced, people have emotional problems. There's psychiatric problems. Too much fear, too much anger. You cannot feel the pleasure of life. You have depression. So if we're going to make progress in treating people that have emotional imbalances, we have to develop new medicines that rebalance these emotional systems. So the aim of affective neuroscience is to go to the very foundation of mind. Mind means experience, subjective experience. Mind at a fundamental level means some kind of volition. The system wants to do something. Mm-hmm. And the emotional systems want to do something. They want to hit, they want to run away, they want to caress like mother and child. They want to cry. They want to laugh. And we finally are at a moment in the intellectual history of our species where we can finally understand these biologically as opposed to just verbally describing them. That's what affective neuroscience is.
So this sounds very psychological to me. Mm-hmm. Psychology has quite an erratic view on emotions. Sometimes it didn't look at all. How can we define emotions, if we even can define the redness of a rose?
Well, that is the same dilemma as the redness of the rose and the blueness of the sky and the greenness of the forest. These are gifts of nature that were built into our brain as tools for living. And a definition of these primitive psychological processes is impossible with words. They are so primitive and they are shared across all mammals that they have to be defined neuroscientifically. They are brain processes. We have to identify how many there are. We have to identify the locations of the brain that are important. We have to identify the chemistries that control them. And then we have to understand how we develop a language to talk about them clearly. The languages are symbolic. higher order symbolic things. And because of the nature of language, many people right now interested in emotions go directly to the language level. But the foundation of our emotional mind is primitive and it's pre-verbal. It's pre-symbolic. Mm-hmm. It is symbolic in the sense that these are tools for living that enhance survival. So a good example is pain. Pain is horrible, but pain is our friend. Because pain allows us to survive. People that have a neurological disorder where they cannot fear or feel pain and fear pain, they always die young. Mm-hmm. Because they injure their bodies. They don't have the feedback. So these automatic symbols of evolutionary survival issues are the affects, the feelings. And again, there are the sensory affects like pain or taste. There are the bodily affects like hunger and thirst. And then there are the within brain affects, the emotions. So we have to look at it many levels. At a very fundamental level, all mammals share the same emotions. The evidence is very powerful for that. On top of that, we have learning mechanisms. And the learning mechanisms operate with the feelings. So psychologists used to have to use words before they understood these things. And they developed words like reinforcement for learning. And everyone wonders, what is reinforcement? No one knows. No one knows. And they said, well, there are good reinforcements, positive reinforcements, and there are negative reinforcements. To this day, we don't know what they are. They're just words. Okay? So we have understanding through concepts. What affective neuroscience has told us, that the feelings are built into the nervous system in a certain way. At a fundamental level, even a little baby has feelings. All mammals, perhaps all vertebrates, have feelings. And the evidence for that is enormous. But those ideas are a challenge for the field. Because the other animals, ever since René Descartes, were just automatons, scarecrows. As T.S. Eliot said, scarecrows in the wind. Being moved this way and that way by the environment. But in fact, what Darwin told us, and it's a correct view, is that the organism is built in a complex and coherent way. They have a presence in the world, and we all have a very similar presence. Mm-hmm. And that presence is very deeply emotional. Just think of a baby. A baby gets happy and looking for things, and then something happens and it cries, and they all cry. And they all want food, and they want water, and they want their mother to hold them because it feels so good. And the mother wants to hold them because that's the way motherhood feels good. Our sexuality is built on positive feelings, and we can feel very lonely, very depressed, very sad, every one of us. And that's built into us. And what we even found was that the desire to play, to interact with each other in a happy way, is built into us. And that is the play system. And that's the way we discovered laughter in other animals.
We'll come to that. Okay. So I realize, even if we can't describe the redness of a rose, you know quite well how to describe feelings, but your real research is in the brain, in the matter. So where are emotions in the brain? You already talked about chemicals. Helen Fisher, it can't be just that.
Well, the brain is, I think, one of the most complex things in the world that we are aware of. It is a universe of complexity as complex as what we see with a Hubble Space Telescope out there. So, we have this world outside and we have this world within. And in the inside world, the brain is the most complex organ. It is the only organ where we can see the footprint of evolution. You think about your stomach and your liver and all your other organs, and they are similar in all mammals. If you took a little slice of tissue, you couldn't tell whether this liver is from a cow or a human being. Maybe an expert can, but you cannot see the evolution. Inside the brain is like the Grand Canyon in reverse. You know, here's this object, not just a valley where you can see the evolution of Mother Earth. In the brain, you can see layers of evolution. Because what came first cannot be thrown away. It is always kept there in some form. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's pushed into a deep unconscious. Some parts are made larger because they're valuable for your kind of animal. But what is most ancient is in the middle of the brain. Mm-hmm. And farther down in the brain. What is more recent is more outside in the brain and higher up in the brain. Mm-hmm. So the basic emotions, the ones you're born with, we call them primary emotions. They are far down in the brain and they're in the middle. And we can almost tell which ones are more recent. Anger and fear came early. Mm-hmm. Sadness and joy and play came later. Mm-hmm. Because they're higher up. And they're a bit farther lateral. They go farther up in the brain. Anger and fear remain lower in the brain. So how do we know that about these emotional systems? That has been a dilemma for psychology. It's been a dilemma for neuroscience. And the most powerful technique for telling us where the emotions are was a technique that was first used by Walter Hess in Zurich, Switzerland, back in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And Hess received the Nobel Prize in 1949 because he was looking for the nervous system that controls your viscera, mm-hmm. your stomach, your internal organs. So he was looking for what's called the automatic nervous system that controls your heart rate, your digestion, blood pressure, the primitive things. Mm-hmm. So he was stimulating the brain with electricity here and there and everywhere. And he found that in certain areas you would increase the heart rate, increase the blood pressure, increase salivation, decrease salivation. But he also found that when he stimulated these areas of the brain, the animals would become very angry in their behavior. Mm-hmm. So he didn't get a Nobel Prize for finding anger in the brain. He found it for the autonomic visceral nervous system in the brain. But we now know that the emotions come from the visceral nervous system in the brain. That's why emotions feel so intense in our bodies. We feel them in our stomachs, in our hearts, in the tightness or looseness, relaxation of our body. So these ancient emotional systems can be activated with electrical stimulation that contains no information, just energy. Mm-hmm. If you take your computer and you put an electrode in it and just put energy randomly in it, you ruin your computer. It's a piece of junk soon. Whereas if you put electricity into any mammal brain and you stimulate it, you can produce at least 7 types of emotional responses. Okay? Hess found an anger type of response, but he did not call it anger. He called it sham rage, namely just a puppet response, the way René Descartes would have talked about it. But he actually believed that the animal felt angry. But he never expressed that idea until he retired and was writing his last books. Mm-hmm. And he said he was sorry for not being honest with the public. He was not true to his own convictions. He said he always thought the animals were angry. But he did not want to have his work pushed to the side by the American behaviorists.
Okay.
The American behaviorists gave us a lesson that you do not talk about the mind, you only talk about behavior. So sham rage is like a puppet pretending they're angry. So it's just a motor manifestation and not the psychological component. Well, that was one of the first experiments I replicated in another species. Instead of cats, I did rats. And I found that the anatomy of the rat anger system was similar to what Hess and others had described in cats. But I went one step further. I asked the animal, do you like this feeling? Do you dislike this feeling?
Okay.
Or perhaps it doesn't matter to you. Rene Descartes would have said, it will not matter. It's a puppet. Walter Hess followed that with shame. Mm-hmm. He said that, but he didn't believe that because he didn't have the data. But the only way you can ever ask an animal whether it's having a feeling is whether it's a reward or a punishment. Mm. And I asked the question whether this kind of stimulation is good or bad for the animal's feelings. Every animal that was made angry, given the chance, would turn it off. Mm-hmm. Would turn it off, meaning it was a punishment. It was not something they wanted to have happen inside of them. Mm-hmm. There were other things that you could stimulate, and they loved to press the lever and turn on electricity. And this was originally discovered by James Olds and Peter Milner at McGill University in Canada. And it was called the brain reward system. And that language is still being used. And it's a very bad language. It's a language passed down to us before we understood anything about the brain. Mm-hmm. Because there are rewards and punishments in the world. I'm thirsty, I want water. I'm hungry, I want food. Those are objects in the world, like red objects and blue objects. But we know the red and blue are in our brains. They're not in the world, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way, rewards and punishments are feelings of the brain. That's what it looks like. So we learn to do things that increase good feelings, and we stop doing things that cause bad feelings. And this helps us survive. It's very simple. A 5-year-old child can understand it. But scientists decided not to understand it that way. And they created dilemmas that are impossible to solve without neuroscience. And they told us neuroscience was not important. These are the American behaviorists. They called it the black box. Just leave it. You don't have to study it. You have to look at inputs and outputs, and that's it. That was dogma. That was Bible. That's the way I was taught.
And that's why you wrote a letter to Skinner.
Yes, I did write a very, very long letter to Skinner. You've read it? A part of it, maybe. It's a very long letter to Skinner. And Skinner responded and said, well, yes, a complete understanding would require that. But those are not my questions. They might be someone else's questions, but that would not really be psychology. That would be neuroscience, and I'm a psychologist. And so I thought it was a very weak answer because he was an old man, and he was seeing that around him there was a cognitive revolution, people talking about what's in the mind. And he was feeling a bit lonely that his ideas were not as important as they used to be. Mm. And I think he could have used the latter part of his life to look at the complete picture and say, we did a very important thing, and there are other important things to be done, and encouraged people to do them, including talking about the mind. The mind is what the internal experiences are. And the emotions are very important parts of the mind. I would even argue that maybe our mind is built upon emotions. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is that if we harm the emotional systems dramatically, consciousness itself begins to disappear. And that's very dramatic demonstration. If you damage those deep medial parts of the brain, consciousness disappears. Everyone agrees about that. One possible conclusion is that the mind itself is fundamentally feeling affective. And emotional, the valued feelings like pleasant, unpleasant taste, good emotions like play and desire and maternal love are the things that upon which the rest is built, because they're biological values.
This is a beautiful picture. I still remember your critique at the word reward system. Yes. And you mentioned examples that sound to me more like motivators from outside.
Well, I called it many names: a desire system, expectancy system, a seeking system. And finally I decided that since I might have been the only person in the world at that point studying the primary processes upon which the mind was built, that I had the right to choose a terminology. So how do you convince people to use a useful language, but still a specialized scientific language? And I decided the only way was to use a term that had meaning already, but to use it in a way that people would find unusual. So I decided to capitalize every letter. And all the basic emotions now are capitalized. And the emotional system you're talking about is what we call the seeking system, that was originally called the brain reward system. Now, anyone that's really worked on these systems in the brain knows the brain has many reward systems, many good feelings. They are related in many ways, chemically and anatomically, but they can be distinguished. So the seeking system does many things. It looks for all resources. It does not give us the pleasure of food or the pleasure of water. It gives us the enjoyment of life, the enthusiasm to be in the world. At a very intense level, we would call it euphoria. The psychiatric disorder of overactivity of this system could be mania. You are so on top of the world that you'll do anything. All ideas seem good. All investments are wise. And this is the problem of excessive joy, that you are not realistic anymore. So this system looks for resources for survival. That's its basic function, because every organism has to move from here, where it's sitting like you and I are, and move and get water, move and get food. And you should not have a separate system for every reward, just having one general system that goes for all rewards and feels good. Looking for resources should not feel bad. You might be hungry, but when you see that there's an opportunity to find food, you're enthusiastic. And that feeling comes from this system. And of course the tragedy is that when it interacts with higher brain processes, it can become addicted to drugs. It can become addicted to gambling. It can get addicted to sex. So drugs, sex, and rock and roll ultimately use this system. But it is also a resource for the intellect. It puts ideas together. You know, as Kant said, we have no way of knowing the world. We simply have to associate experiences. Those experiences that go together form an idea, a concept in the world. This system also generates interest, creativity in the world. It's very important for artistic urges. So it has a primitive organization, but upon it, it can build many levels. So That's true for every emotional system. There's a basic form of it. It controls learning, what we call a secondary process, and then it also interacts with higher parts of the mind that are initially empty. It's like your computer. You've got a brand new computer. It just has an operating system. It can do things, but basically it has no information yet. Mm-hmm. So it has empty memory space. And all your software, all your pieces of information are put in there by experience. But without the operating system, nothing gets put in. So my kind of primary process, emotional analysis, is trying to produce a realistic scientific image of the operating systems of the brain that are experienced, that are important for learning, that eventually are important for thought.